Good morning. Welcome back to Lucore Automotive Services. Today, we're going to start working on this 1968 Camaro. So the owner of this 1968 Camaro, he picked this car up. It was a dedicated track car for many years. It just ran in straight lines a quarter mile at a time. But the new owner wants to use it more on the street than on the strip. Now, this car has 383, probably a pretty well built one. We dynoed this car on the chassis dyno and it pulled a hair under 300 horse, but when we backed out of the throttle we noticed it was letting out some smoke, shall we say, out of the passenger side tailpipe. So before we remove this engine from this car, we're actually going to pull all the plugs, do a cylinder compression test, just to give us a little bit more insight as to the health status of this engine, because we are actually going to be listing this engine for sale. As we bring this car back to the street, we are actually going to be installing a new GM crate motor to make it a little more street friendly. This car currently has MSD. It has basically has a toggle switch for an electric water pump. It has a toggle switch for the fuel pump. It has a toggle switch for the cooling fan. It has a toggle switch for the ignition system. Probably a couple more toggle switches. So we're gonna, since we're going back to street use for this car, we want to turn the key and start it and let it run, and then turn the key off to turn the car off. We also want an engine that has engine vacuum at idle so that we can utilize the brake system without having to have an additional vacuum pump to run that. So basically we're going to be pulling a bunch of parts out of this car and then putting minimal items back into the car while still maintaining good looks, good performance, and easy streetable use. Another thing this car has is it has solid motor mounts. So a rigid mounted engine in a street car is really no fun at all. It vibrates and you feel everything out of that engine, and you get out of the car and your body's still vibrating. It's kind of like when you ride in a boat and you're out in a boat all day and then you come back on land and you're on land and your body's still swaying because of the waves. It's a similar sensation with this car. Sitting in a vibrator can be fun, but not in this way. So we're going to return this car to the street and make some upgrades, make some improvements, and we're gonna bring you along for the ride. We hope you like the show. Please hit like, comment below, subscribe to our channel so that you can see some of the stuff that we do in the shop, and this is some of the more cool stuff. A lot of the normal stuff is just brake jobs and transmissions and engines and other stuff. But hey, it's what we do. How about a pan shot? Pan shot of all our stickers. So the first step in this process, I'm going to pull all of our spark plugs, do a compression test, and then if I see anything that worries me, we'll do a cylinder leak down test. A compression test tells you there is a problem in a specific cylinder. A cylinder leak down test tells you so much more. A cylinder leak down test can tell you, do you have bad rings, an intake valve that's not sealing, an exhaust valve that's not sealing, or compression loss due to a gasket failure or cylinder crack or cylinder head crack. Basically it gives you that much more information before you tear apart the car, so you know what you're looking for. It's like, oh, I have compression loss, pull it apart. Hey, I've got a busted head gasket. Good, that's easy. Get everything fixed, put it back together. So I'm going to get these plugs out. We'll do our cylinder compression tests, and then we will pop this engine out of this car. So I have all my spark plugs out. I'm not seeing anything on the spark plugs that gives me much concern. They are all heavily carboned, which isn't surprising because this carburetor is probably jetted to run wide open throttle, not really to be driven around on the street, so it's probably building up carbon on the plugs because it's not being run hard enough. I did notice that the TV cable is not adjusted correctly. So that's a little concern. This car just had a new transmission put in it a little while ago because this car had a manual valve body turbo 350 in it, which was pulled out and apparently replaced with a Street 700R4 or I don't know what, no, it's a turbo 350. It's cable actuated. So we'll double check that and make sure that is set up correctly on the next one so we don't burn up his new transmission. Fluid's still nice and clean and red, so sorry, it's a kickdown cable. That makes more sense. Because the turbo 350s use a vacuum actuator for line pressure, but I don't see where their vacuum line's at. That must be it there, going down to the trans. But their kickdown cable is not attached correctly, so it probably did not kick down correctly. But we'll fix that when we put the new engine in. So as I take a car apart, I pay attention to a lot of different things because the car tells you a story as you take it apart. Some of it good, some of it not so good. This car is pretty well put together. This is our vacuum pump. It will be leaving the engine bay. That's our MSD ignition. It will also be leaving the engine bay. Electric water pump. We're going to be going with a belt-driven one. The new engine has a serpentine drive system with water pump and power steering pump and alternator and all that stuff. So we can upgrade things as we go. So when I took this apart, I did find some plug wires that are burned through. So we were probably losing some spark here and there. I don't see any signs from the spark plugs that we have any coolant type issues as far as head gasket or anything like that, so that's good. So I'm going to get my compression tester out. We'll do compression on this thing real quick. I am actually going to pull the carb off the car, that way I don't have to hold the throttle open, and then we will go from there. So I'm almost ready to do my compression test on this. I'm going to pull the carburetor off since this engine's on its way out. It's a little less work for me to do later. Okay, good to know. Alright. Your gasket seal. Wow, that is one seriously ported intake manifold. That's a nice piece. Oh. Well, that'll make it run bad. Those are supposed to be attached. So, that was weird that was not screwed down. That's a lot of gear play. I'm going to guess we're going to find a worn gear on our distributor too. It's all these little things that add up to losses in horsepower. Not having the ignition correct would cause all sorts of problems. So I went through and did my compression test on the passenger side bank. Everything came in within 5 psi. Basically we're hitting 195 to 200 in each cylinder. My front cylinder over here is also 200. The other three I can't really get my compression tester on with the headers on. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the headers and get this engine ready to pull out of the car. Yeah, not too much else to do. It's pretty simple in this situation. There's only a few wires, a couple sending units for the gauges, and a few vacuum lines. So it won't be too hateful to get apart and get this engine out of this car. I'm not too worried about the integrity of the engine. I think there's room for improvement, but mechanically I don't see anything wrong with the engine. We actually drove this car 40 miles before we started taking it apart. Drove it down to the engine dyno, ran it on the engine dyno, pulled it off the engine dyno, drove it back here, and now I'm pulling the motor out of it. So pretty solid engine for somebody who's going to make them a really nice higher RPM runner. The ports in this intake manifold are amazing. So my carburetor's off. My compression looks good on this bank. So now it's time to drain my engine coolant, remove my headers, remove my electrical, and then it will be time to put it up in the air, pull my bell housing bolts, pull my torque converter bolts, my motor mounts, and then I should be able to pull this thing right out of here. Moving on, moving forward. As my coolant finishes draining, I noticed the battery has no battery tray. So we will put a battery tray in this to lock this battery down, because that's not something we want flopping around in this thing. Put that on my list of things to address. So right now I'm going to pull a battery out. I'm going to disconnect my alternator, disconnect my positive and negative cables, unbolt my headers, pull my radiator so it's out of the way, although it has a transmission cooler zip tied to it, so we will fix that as well. I will probably just pull it loose up here and try not to bleed. Doing it. Those are sharp. Oh, please don't stab me. That's going to make me bleed before the end of this project. So I have my radiator out. Basically, I pulled my headers completely out of the car. My header gaskets were leaking. Some of the header bolts are MIA, even though they had lock washers on them. They vibrate loose. It's just that's header life. You have to get out and retorque your header bolts all the time. They do make little snap ring lock header bolts that will help prevent them from working loose, but header bolts are always coming loose. It's a fact of life when you run headers on a car. You have to get out and retorque them from time to time. So I am down to bell bolts, flex plate bolts, and engine mount bolts. So 11 more bolts and it's time to pop this engine out of this engine bay. Pretty good progress for this morning. Comp Engineering 3-way Moroso 3-way adjustable shocks. I don't see how they're adjustable. These shocks are for drag racing, not for street use. We will definitely be upgrading the shocks on this car because it's no longer a drag race car, it is now a street car. It will probably ride a lot better with a good set of normal shocks in it. It's already got a nice big upgraded sway bar. It has a manual rack and pinion steering system in it, but we may actually go back to the stock power steering system or a power steering rack and pinion for this car. It's got drag shocks in the rear as well. Those will come out for some normal shocks. And it has monoleafs with traction adders. I think once we get some good shocks in this, I think we'll be okay. We can probably leave the traction adders. It'll be a little more rough of a ride with those traction adders, but we'll see one step at a time. We'll get shocks on it first. So all I need to pull is, I need to put a battery in my flashlight. I'll pull my flex plate bolts. Remove my bell bolts, and she's ready to come out of the car. That's got to come off because it goes through the engine mount. I'll pull that off real quick. And that's all she wrote. So I'm getting ready to pull my transmission bolts out of this. My flex plate bolts have already been pulled. My top two bell bolts are really kind of hard to get to. They're way up in there. So I'm going to use my really super long extension. Hopefully. And if this one's not long enough, I have a longer one. But this should be long enough. To get my top two bell bolts. There's one. And I should be able to get this one from over here. All is good. Yep, all is good. Two. My upper side bell bolts are already out. I left my bottom two in because I can get those with the transmission in place. And I'm going to put the transmission cross member back in. But this thing has a rigid transmission mount, so I'm going to replace that with a urethane one. But I'll do that when I go put this thing all back together, because one, I don't have the transmission mount here, and two, I have to put the transmission cross member back in and then take it back out to put the top bell bolts in when I put the new motor in. So I'm going to put the cross member back in, loosely bolt this in, that way my transmission's supported, and it'll just hang in the bottom of the car while I pull this engine out and put the new engine in. Put a couple rags in there, make sure I don't have any nuts or bolts hanging out. Actually, I'm going to do something better than that. So stuffing rags in the intake is one way to do it. But I know this engine's probably going to be sitting on an engine stand for a while. I'm going to go ahead and just tape off the intake. All right. So that's covered up. I think I've got everything resolved. That'll work. Bring in my engine hoist. Now I have a transmission jack underneath, or a floor jack underneath my transmission with a board on it to make sure the transmission pan doesn't get crushed. which we see a lot, but I'm going to lift this engine up to get the pressure off of my engine mount bolts. Pull my engine mount bolts and this thing should be out, and we can start cleaning up what we need to clean up. So as we continue through this project, we will make it much more streetable, much more comfortable to drive, much more road friendly. We might even get it so far that his wife might even ride in the car with him. That'll be a feat. At any rate, remember to give us a like, post a comment, subscribe to our channel. We got more crazy stuff like this going on. We're just a small garage in Central Ohio, bunch of car guys who love cars. We thought we'd share some of the cool stuff with you guys. There's no sponsored materials that we're installing. These are all parts that the customers have purchased for these cars, and they are paying us to install them into their vehicles. We do a lot with muscle cars. We do imports. I work on a lot of 6-liter and 7.3 turbo diesel trucks. We work on a lot of work trucks for people. We're just here to help keep some old cars on the road and keep your work trucks making you money. That's what we do. You guys have a great night. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.